Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome back, bookends, to our September book club episode. This month's book club episode is dedicated to Shy Creatures, the latest novel from author of the best-selling Small Pleasures, Clare Chambers. Shy Creatures is a powerful and life-affirming novel set mostly in a psychiatric hospital in the 60s. It's a novel that explores the healing powers and possibilities of kindness, the different ways in which we can be confined, and the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Clare Chambers is a British novelist. She studied English at Oxford and after graduating moved to New Zealand, where she wrote her first novel, Uncertain Terms, which was published when she was just 25. She has since written 9 other novels. Clare began her career as a secretary at the publisher Andre Dutch when Diana Athill was still at the helm, and as well as being a novelist, she has worked as a freelance copy editor and a creative writing teacher. Her novel Learning to Swim won the Romantic Novels Association Best Novel Award and was adapted as a Radio 4 play. Prior to Shy Creatures, her novel Small Pleasures, published in 2021, was Clare's first work of fiction in 10 years and became a word-of-mouth hit. It was selected for BBC Two Between the Covers Book Club, selected as Book of the Year by The Times, Daily Telegraph and read among numerous other publications, and it was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2021. Her latest novel, Shy Creatures, is out now and published by W&N, and here to chat all about it, welcome Clare to A Pair of Bookends.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on. I'm very excited to have you, and I have absolutely loved being in the world of Shy Creatures, and I also recently read Small Pleasures and loved both of them, and I'm so excited that I've got your backlist to look forward to now. But before we get onto your books, I want to ask you what you're currently reading.
Well, what I'm currently reading at the moment it's a proof of a book that's coming out in September, so it's very current, and it's called Missing Person Alice by Simon Mason, and he's a thriller writer. He's written a series of thrillers set in Oxford, which are also very good, but this is a sort of departure. It's a very short detective sort of detective novel. I won't say it's a crime novel exactly, about a missing girl, and it's what's so great about it is it's very short, but it's incredibly densely plotted, and it's if you like a book that's all story and no flannel, no kind of not long descriptions or long backstories of the characters and their descriptions of their relationships and things. It's just the plot and the investigation and what happened and what happens. And it's really a real page turner. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really loved it.
That sounds great. I will have to add that to my list. And I was curious then when you were saying it being a sort of mystery thriller, what are your reading tastes like? Are you quite drawn to that genre, or do you read quite a mix?
Yeah, I do read. A fair mix. I mean, one of my favourite genres is westerns. I really love cowboy books,
I love
which
that.
is quite unexpected. But I really like reading about people who aren't like me. I do like detective or crime fiction. I don't really like things that are too gory or too violent or too kind of graphic in their descriptions, especially violence against women. I find that a bit, makes me a bit queasy. So I don't read anything, I would say, really kind of brutal, but I like the kind of plotty puzzle of a crime novel or a mystery novel. And this Missing Person series is about, it's just sort of the distilled essence of the mystery novel. It's very, very densely plotted, and there's stuff happening and red herrings and that kind of thing all the time, and that's exactly how I like it.
I love that. Have you read, just what you're saying about loving Western novels, have you read The Muslim Cowboy?
No, I haven't. That sounds promising.
Yes, it's coming out very soon. It's published by Dead Ink Books and it's by Bruce Omar Yates. It's a very short book, but it really packs a punch. It's brilliant, and I've never really read Western novels. I didn't think that they'd be my cup of tea, but I was completely wrong, because this was just incredible and really cleverly written. And my episode with Bruce is going out the week before this, so I think his book is coming out at the very end of August, around the same time as yours, but it's really great. So if you can get your hands on it, do. I think you'd really enjoy it. Now, I wanted to ask you because on Shy Creatures, you've said it's impossible to write about the genesis of Shy Creatures without mentioning Small Pleasures, though they are not companion volumes in any way. I wrote Small Pleasures from a position of weakness and no great confidence, having been unpublished for many years with my backlist barely in print. Its surprisingly warm reception owed something to my personal resurrection story, and you've described this as your kind of career reversal. But I wanted to ask, what was this experience like for you? And do you remember sort of realizing that Small Pleasures was becoming a success?
Yes, I do. I do remember. It was very gradual. It wasn't. I mean, it wasn't an overnight success at all. Sometimes it's been described as having been sold at auction, and that really wasn't quite. It felt more like a boot fair to me than an auction because the sums involved weren't huge or generous. It was three publishers offered for it, but they offered the same amount, so it was,
Right.
and they weren't budging, and it wasn't huge. So it was just a question of choosing which publisher I liked the look of. It wasn't a bidding war or anything. So I thought this, it hadn't got off to a huge boom at the start, but nevertheless, my expectations were pretty low. I was just hoping to be published again. That was my goal, to get published again after 10 years of not being published. And I was extremely happy when publishers were interested in it with my backlist, my record not being that great. So that was the sort of, my goal had already been achieved when I got taken on. But then once this beautiful jacket that they designed for it with these beautiful oranges, tangerines on it, sort of started to appear on social media, it seemed to kind of get a bit of momentum behind it. And I thought, oh, this is interesting, because my previous books had been published in the era before social media, really. And so the idea of word of mouth wasn't really that useful in those days. But now word of mouth really meant something when somebody with a big platform can recommend something. And it gets a bit of traction. So I started to notice just before publication that there was a bit of interest growing in it. And I thought, oh, this is exciting, and I think I suppose I've noticed that the change came when I got chosen to be on Between the Covers and having to actually be on television with a book. And the idea of a book being on TV just felt to me, such a leap in terms of publicity and reach. And I sort of thought that was the moment when it started to tip in my favour, and the momentum kind of grew from there. But it was gradual. It was a sort of, it wasn't kind of it wasn't like a top 10 bestseller when it came out. It was a gradual thing, and then it just started to sell, and it's still selling. It's still doing well even 4 years on. So it was an absolutely career changing event for me.
I can imagine. I do remember seeing it all over social media, and I really do think that book covers can help, because we're so drawn to sort of visuals now that I think that really helps. But it is a beautiful story, and I loved that book so much. And it's really hard because I was like, I think I read you saying that Shy Creatures is almost like a second novel, but it's actually not for you. And we're recording this approaching publication. How are you feeling about Shy Creatures and the kind of reception that you might receive?
Well, obviously, if you've had a book that was popular and lots of people liked, you worry that they'll be disappointed, and they'll say, oh, not as good as. That's sort of in the back of your mind, but you just have to write the book that you're moved to write, and hope that readers enjoy it. I mean, my style is consistent. It's not, I haven't, although I've used a different structure and a different period and different characters, and it's not a similar book in any other way apart from my writing style, which is just my voice. So I think people who like Small Pleasures, I don't think will be horrified by this book or reject it. It's just, some may prefer it. They may prefer, the people who didn't like the ending of Small Pleasures may prefer this book. I don't want to say more than that, but
of course,
there was a certain amount of disappointment in that from readers. So you don't know how it's going to be received, and it's not really the writer's business to worry about its reception. You just try and write the best book you can, and you just send it out there, and try not to kind of stress about whether people are going to like it or not.
Of course, you've got to kind of let that go.
Yeah.
I'm I'm an actor and I definitely have to do that. You go on, you do your job, you come off, and you just have to let it be.
Yeah.
What will be, will be. But let's dive into Shy Creatures. And you did just mention that you sort of write in a similar style for each book. And I'm thinking specifically of Small Pleasures and Shy Creatures because they both, to me, read like a blend of literary fiction and sort of mystery in a way. But what do you think it is that attracts you to write in this sort of atmosphere of mystery? And do you feel that you're working out your characters and their intentions as you write, or do you kind of plot most of your story beforehand?
I think I'm drawn to the idea of having a kind of mystery in the books because I feel you need some kind of hook to pull the reader through.
Mm-hmm.
You need a question that hasn't been answered that they'll want to know the answer to. You know, I think it takes a very confident writer to write a book that's not really about anything. I mean, it's possible, and such books are, you know, can be brilliant. But I think you need a kind of question and a mystery or something unexplained just to just beckon the reader indoors, really. So I always try to do that. But I'm very much a planner, to answer the other part of your question now. I don't let the book kind of grow organically because I tried that in the past and it just didn't work. And I wasted about 4 years writing a book that just didn't work because it just grew in different directions and was kind of rambling and it didn't really have a plot. As my agent kindly said, it had 6 subplots and no plot. And I think that was true, and I hadn't noticed it. And so now I'm much more focused about spending a lot of time plotting and planning so that there aren't any of these kind of Bermuda triangles that you hit when you're writing and you get about halfway through and you're at sea and you don't really know how to navigate through it. And I don't like that feeling. And I feel I'm a bit too old to spend many years in it and, blundering around. And I need to know where I'm going before I start. So I hold off that moment of starting until I'm very sure where I'm going. And there's always an impulse to start a bit earlier than you should with writing. I feel that the enthusiasm to get going takes you before you really know where you're going, and you have to resist it and work out where you're going first and then give in to that sort of impulse. I mean, I think a lot of writers don't do that. They write in a very different way, and you can't tell from reading their books which method they've used.
Yes, yeah.
Often. But I find that this method is now the one I favour. Just plan.
Well, I love the way that you write, and I feel like you kept me guessing all the way through both books. And I know that, I mean, both Small Pleasures and Shy Creatures are sort of inspired by true stories, but we're specifically talking about Shy Creatures, and you did take inspiration from a news story that you saw. Could you tell us a bit about that story and how you came across it?
Yeah, I think I first came across it when I was researching the 50s for Small Pleasures, and I was looking in a local newspaper archive. I always go for local newspapers because they tend to take on these kind of quirky stories that don't always make the national newspapers and then become famous, so people don't already know about them if you look in local papers. And I came across this story about this man who was living in Bristol, and he'd been found in a house with his elderly aunt, and he was in his 40s, and he'd been living there for at least 20 years without the neighbours or anybody knowing he was there. And he was either kind of a prisoner or a recluse. And anyway, he was rescued from this situation and taken to a psychiatric hospital. And I thought, he didn't speak really. So I was also kind of interested to find out what happened to him and whether they could actually cure him and make him, able to be rehabilitated in society in a normal way. He'd been found in quite a feral kind of state with a sort of, beard down to the ground or whatever. The newspaper article slightly varied as to his hairiness. I've got to say, it wasn't consistent. And I just looked ahead in time trying to find whether or not there was anything in the papers about his treatment. And I found a year later that he'd escaped from the institution and either jumped or fallen into a river and drowned. And I thought, oh, what a terrible ending, having just achieved freedom to, what a sad story. And it just made me think perhaps I could try and write something that would explain how he got into this state, but then also try and write him a future that was more hopeful than the truth. So that was the start of it. And then I just moved it into the 60s because I didn't want to write about the 50s again, having done so recently. And, I just wanted to do something new. And the 60s was also a very interesting time in the history of psychiatry and the treatment of mental health. So that seemed a kind of logical place to set it. And then when you're a fiction writer, you don't have to honour the facts of your sources. You can do what you like with them. So I just thought, right, I'm just going to move it a decade forward and just take that as my springboard for this story.
Yeah, of course. So you just said that you obviously set it in the 60s, and as I said in the intro, that it's mainly set in a psychiatric hospital. And I was curious whether psychiatry was something that you've always been interested in, or whether it was just that you were led by this story. Sorry, the true story, I mean. And with you speaking about this particular time period, it is, of course, when art therapy was in its infancy. And I wondered, why did this role feel fitting for your protagonist, Helen?
Yeah, I have always been interested in, I mean, not always, not since I was a child, but, I have been interested in psychiatry, and I read books of case histories of psychiatric treatments and things, and they're incredibly fascinating and interesting to read. There's a book called The Examined Life, I think it's called, by Stephen Grolsch, and God's Executioner by Irving Yalom. And they're just case histories. They've been anonymized, but they're just fascinating. That the disordered mind is just endlessly interesting. And then I started to research R.D. Laing, who was a sort of key figure of psychiatry in the 1960s, and his, at the time, sort of controversial view that madness was really just a sort of society's way of exerting control over people and trying to make them conform, and that there was no, it was quite a controversial kind of position. I've sort of greatly oversimplified it, but he was an interesting figure. So I started to research that, and I thought, I don't really want this to be a patient psychiatrist novel where we've got chapters of treatment, and consultations and things. I felt that wasn't really going to be dynamic enough, and then I the more I researched about the 60s, I came across this notion of art therapy as this new more humane therapy for patients, and I thought that this gave me an opportunity to have this character who wasn't a doctor, wasn't high up in the hierarchy, but was more subordinate, and also it enabled me to discuss art and that kind of thing as well. And so I hit on having a female art therapist as the main protagonist, and therefore that she would be trying to help this man who was a gifted artist himself in a way that the psychiatrist, the sort of expert, the professional, couldn't really do. So that was really how that kind of came to be a sort of a plank of the plot, really.
Yeah, and I do think art therapy, like art, is such a healing thing, and I am really passionate about encouraging creativity, and I think it's a really great method for people to use. I'd never come across R.D. Laing's work before. I don't know how I'd missed it. I feel like I must have heard about there's a case of a woman who had wiped her feces on the wall, I think, I definitely recall reading about that somewhere, but I don't think I'd heard about him specifically, so I was reading about him this morning, and it's really fascinating to look at the kind of history of psychiatry. Was there anything in your research that particularly struck you?
Yeah, there was a really interesting book by Laing and Esterson, which was called Sanity, Madness and the Family. And it was a series of interviews with mainly girls, teenage girls, or perhaps a little bit older, some men as well, I think, who'd been admitted to psychiatric hospitals for what was loosely diagnosed as schizophrenia, I suppose. And it was interviews with them, and then separately interviews with their family members. And there was no kind of commentary really added to it. It was just recording question and answers. And what became apparent was that these girls were sort of really just kind of mystified by their life situation and living in sort of almost intolerable family situations, not necessarily abusive, but just kind of being pressurized from different directions and being given conflicting advice and conflicting, I don't know, I can't really explain it, but being mystified really by what the expectations are of them from their families. Where they're told, oh, you stay in too much, you go out too much. I'm oversimplifying, but that kind of thing, just being told different things that slightly bamboozle them. And the more you read it, the more you thought there's nothing wrong with these girls. There's nothing wrong with their brains or their minds. It's their situation that's the problem. And that was a really interesting book, which kind of got me thinking about the character of Lorraine in the book as a sort of teenage girl on the cusp of adulthood in this time of great change, when the teenager was just becoming a sort of social phenomenon, and what it would be like to be living in a family who are traditionalists and are looking at all this change with some mistrust and trepidation. So that was really inspiration for that strand of the book. But, the more I read, the more the book just kind of grew, really, because there was another useful book called Asylums by Irving Goffman, which is kind of compares institutions with each other, like prisons, psychiatric hospitals and boarding schools, and draws the parallels between these institutions in the way that they depersonalize people and exert control, and the similar ways they seek to kind of modify people's behavior and control them. And I thought, yes, I can use that as well. And the family too is a sort of institution, and at its best, it can be incredibly healing and powerful and a force for good. And I've tried to illustrate that in one of the families. And at its worst, it can be like an institution, like the worst kind of institution that just imprisons and controls and constricts and represses. So that background reading gave me kind of really, really kind of fertile grounds to start growing this book in.
I feel like there's so much that you could read on psychiatry that is quite overwhelming, but it is such a fascinating subject. And I wanted to touch on, is it Gil? Is that how you say his name? Yeah. I wasn't sure, but there is an affair narrative in the novel, and there's kind of I should say that Gil is one of the therapists at this psychiatric hospital, and he sort of fits the R.D. Lang mold, I would say. He has sort of potentially progressive methods, may be controversial. I don't know which category it would fit in depending on who you are, but there is an affair. Can I say there's an affair without spoiling it? It's not spoiling it, is it?
Absolutely, it's not a spoiler. It's apparent in the first page.
Okay, well, there's an affair, and Helen, the protagonist, and Gil are having this affair, but it's kind of past the point of the passionate, exciting part of the affair. It's further on, and I was curious why you wanted us as readers to sort of meet Helen and Gil at this point in their relationship, and what you felt this dynamic kind of represented about the space that they're inhabiting, but also about their characters.
Well, it's kind of an anti-romance. It's sort of a relationship that's working backwards from a point, from a point of where it's sort of teetering, and then it starts to kind of go downhill. And we get their origin story of how they met, but then we're already at a point where things are not ideal. But it's because it's a what we now call a toxic relationship. I mean, that wasn't a term we would use in the 60s, but it's inappropriate on several levels. They're professional colleagues. He's married, and he's married to one of her relatives, which is kind of an even bigger taboo. So it's not an appropriate relationship in many ways, but I've tried to portray it as being understandable. He's very charismatic, he's very charming and interesting, and he's not, to my mind, he's not a monster. He's just, just your regular bastard. He's not an absolute thoroughgoing bastard. And he has his redeeming features. So I try to make Helen's attraction to him, plausible and understandable. And he treats her as a sort of intellectual equal-ish, and is very appealing. But this is another way of kind of showing women's options and positions. On the one hand, Gil is very progressive about his patients. He's very anti-medicating his patients. In the meantime, his wife is self-medicating with alcohol because of her rotten marriage, and his mistress is self-medicating with sleeping tablets and the contraceptive pill because of her rotten relationship. So, it's kind of gives me a chance to explore the kind of sexual politics of the time.
It was a great relationship to read about, and I love that you described it as an anti-romance, because it's very much that. But I loved their dynamic. I also wanted to touch on, whilst we're talking about characters, I want to touch on the wonderful family, the Kenleys, specifically Marion, though. And I was curious what inspired her character.
Well, she's partly has elements of my mother. I mean, her sportiness, she's an unconventional woman in that she's very sporty. She'd much rather be out in the garden playing cricket than doing housework. She's a very hands-on, fun-loving parent. And my mother was very much like that. She would always rather be out in the garden chucking a netball around than dusting or doing kind of boring houseworky things. And I wanted to put something of that into the character of Marion. And I just wanted to create this idea of a family and a past, a sort of an ideal, although they're not ideal, they're not perfect, but a sort of ideal point in a childhood which you look back to as being a sort of safe haven, a place where you were truly happy, and you spend the rest of your life trying to get back there. And I feel like a lot of people have that in their past. They have a place that they remember as being a kind of ideal, or a family that they got to know who seemed to embody the ideal life. You know, often a friend you go and stay with on holiday, or people you meet when you're abroad or something, and you have this idea of this family who are so much more interesting, so much warmer, so much more engaging than your own kind of normal dull people or whatever and situation. And I wanted to create that feeling, so that for William really to have it in his mind as a point where he was perfectly happy.
Yeah, and it is, you know, very moving parts of the book, and I'm going to tread very carefully because I don't want to give any spoilers, but you know, there is this kind of moving moment where we do flip back and forth between his sort of early memories and where they're at in present day. And William thinks back to a time when he was spending a day with this family, and he kind of observes the families around them, and the parents are just kind of in their own little worlds, just letting the kids run free. But Marion and Basil really care about spending time with the children and making it fun, and you know, they really see them as people and as human beings, and they don't just kind of leave them to do their own thing. And there's something really special about that, because he doesn't, I don't think he feels very seen in his own home. It's very much kind of children must be, I don't know what the phrase was, is it children must be seen and not heard?
Seen and not heard, sort of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
It feels very much like that. You know, he's not felt very seen in his, well, that I suppose that is true. But he, I don't think he feels, you know, very kind of acknowledged in his home. And then he has this experience with them, and it's so special and wonderful. So yeah, I just really loved that.
Oh, good. That was kind of the aim that I was going for, to try and create that feeling, and that past, the sort of, you know, nostalgia is a very powerful emotion, and I wanted we sort of feel it on his behalf as well.
Definitely. And speaking of William, you know, he is such a fascinating character, and he's obviously based on this true person that you read about, and him and his family, his aunts, have sort of lived as recluses, is that the right word, the plural, for quite a long period of time. But there's sort of zero judgment or kind of stereotyping in the way that you write these people. They are, of course, complex individuals, but I was curious what it was like to write them, you know, write these characters that are so kind of removed from your own life. And I was wondering whether our experience of isolation during the pandemic, whether that kind of influenced the way that you wrote these people.
I didn't sort of think about that consciously, but I suppose it must have done. I mean, everything influences us in one way or another. So I feel maybe, you know, that feeling of isolation, and you know, necessary isolation, that we were, you know, willingly prisoners of circumstance, and we kind of were obedient to it mostly. And I think maybe that fed into the way I portrayed this family, who were, you know, sort of deliberately, you know, with this fear of the authorities, fear of busybodies, fear of the neighbours, and there's all sorts of reasons why, which I obviously can't explain without giving the story away, but why they're like this. But and it has lots to do with class and their sense of their declining fortunes. So there's kind of shame and all these kind of awful emotions that are particularly kind of English emotions of you know, shame and sense of failure and worrying about what people will think. You know, there's a lot of that in the book about concern about what other people will think and what's normal. The word normal comes up over and over again as being the thing that we're all aiming for, you know, and society is trying to make us all conform and will sort of bend us all to its will, and the family too. And so I very much enjoyed writing the aunts, but it was a question of just trying to differentiate their characters, make them all very different people, and then have the challenge of going back through time rather than forward in time, and so that your revelations come in the past rather than the future, which is quite a difficult thing to manage. As I discovered, I realised why more books don't use this structure of going backwards, because it does trip you up occasionally, and you have to be careful that you can't, once you've mentioned something, you can't kind of go back to it, because you're never going back in that direction again. You're only going backwards in time. So you have to make sure everything you need to say has already been said, if you see what I mean. It's so that was an interesting way of writing, but it was it kept me on my toes.
Yeah, I can imagine. I suppose my last question on the book would be linking to William and his aunts and kind of where they live. I think what really fascinated me is how does a person kind of go unnoticed for this period of time? You know, how has this kind of happened? And you spoke in a Guardian article. You said that the suburbs are kind of rich terrain for the novelist. Could you tell us why you think it is such a great setting to write about, and particularly, obviously, as a setting for Shy Creatures?
Well, I mean, I'm just a creature of the suburbs myself. I've always lived in the suburbs, and I love the sort of in-betweeniness of it. It's not, it hasn't got that kind of edgy urban thing of the city. It hasn't got the sort of sublime beauty of the countryside. It's just a place where people live to work, really. But it's that, it's where people are kind of most themselves, because there's this tension between the need to kind of fit in with your neighbours. You're all so close together. The tension between the need to fit in and that little urge to break out. And we all have that in us, and I think that's why a lot of sitcoms are set in the suburbs, aren't they? I'm thinking of old sitcoms like The Good Life and Reginald Perrin and Keeping Up Appearances. There's all sorts of and One Foot in the Grave. They're all sort of set in the suburbs because it's very good terrain for comedy, and there's a sort of tragicomedy about it, about our sort of insecurities. We don't want to let the side down, but at the same time we want to kind of break out of these restrictions or whatever. And then because we're so on top of each other, there's this sense of privacy. Everyone's very protective of their privacy. That you think of net curtains and fences and people kind of just talking at chin height over their fences and not really knowing their neighbours necessarily. And so I think it's a sort of place where people are always saying, "Oh, you don't imagine that's this sort of thing happening in a place like this." But this is said so often on the news that it's obviously the sort of place where this is exactly the sort of place where things happen, because it happens almost every night. Somebody's saying, "You don't imagine this happening here, under our noses." But of course, extraordinary things happen under people's noses all the time.
It definitely does. If it wasn't already apparent to our listeners, I absolutely loved Shy Creatures. And when this episode is out, you can buy yourselves a copy of Shy Creatures. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes where you can order yourselves a copy, or you can go into all good bookshops and buy yourselves one. I'm also running a giveaway over on Instagram at A Pair of Bookends Pod, where you can enter the giveaway to win a brand new hardback copy of Shy Creatures, and you really don't want to miss this one. It is so wonderful, and I love this story so much, and you won't be able to get anything else done when you're reading this. It's wonderful. So please go and grab yourselves a copy or enter the giveaway. And before I let you go, Claire, I would love to ask you what you've been reading and loving over the summer.
Several things. I've read a massive housebreak of a book called Lonesome Dove, which is a Western. I told you I like cowboy books, because I was very worried that I was losing the ability from having been on Twitter so much to read more than about 240 characters at a time. So I thought I need to test my concentration to the extent of about 800 pages plus and see if I can actually get to the end of it. And I did, because the book was so brilliantly written, so interesting, and so full of incident that the pages just turned themselves. So that was a relief. And I highly recommend Lonesome Dove. It's absolutely brilliant. And then another book that I wanted to sort of draw people's attention to was, or another writer, I should say, is Helen Garner, who's an Australian writer.
I really want to read Helen Garner.
She's won all the awards, in Australia, yes, but she's not as well known here as she should be. But her fiction and non-fiction is being republished this year by my publisher, which is how I came across her. And I've read her fiction and non-fiction, and it's her non-fiction that particularly interests me. There's a book called This House of Grief, which is, I suppose it would be called true crime, because it's the true story of a murder trial that she covers, and it's a sort of quite, it's a very dark book, because it's a tragic story of a divorced man who drives his car with his 3 children into a reservoir, killing them all, and the trial of this man. But what, it sounds unbearable, and in many ways it is, but Helen Garner's account and her sort of faithful attendance, her fidelity to the facts and to the details of the trial, and her empathy for all the protagonists, that the the witnesses, the accused, the bereaved mother, the lost children, or to everyone involved is so fantastic, and it's so well written and so interesting that it really is a sort of masterpiece of this genre of true crime, and I absolutely recommend it.
That is 1000% going to the top of my list now. That sounds incredible. I had seen that they were doing like reissues of her books, and I'm so pleased that they've come to the UK now, because I've been very jealous looking at Australian book accounts and seeing them reading Helen Garner and being like, I want to get my hands on Helen Garner. So I'm really pleased that they're out now, and that's a really great recommendation, so thank you. I would love to ask, is there anywhere that my listeners can find you on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I just utterly reject calling it whatever it's called now, but
Me too.
yeah, I'm still plugging away on that sort of benighted platform. Yeah, they can find me there, and I'm always ready for a chat.
Wonderful.
Ready to be distracted.
No, please don't distract her. We need more books. Lastly, thank you so much, Claire, for joining me on A Pair of Bookends today. I've loved chatting to you. I love your books, and I'm really excited to dive into your backlist. So yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been really interesting.
Oh, thank you. And for our listeners, as I said, go buy yourselves a copy of Shy Creatures, go give Claire a follow. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. And if you'd like to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.